She had learned to keep her sleeves down, learned to smile when her name became an insult, learned that staying quiet was survival, and that love, in the version she'd been given, came wrapped in bruises and broken apologies. But survival has a shelf life, and Emma Whitlock's ran out on a Tuesday night in a restaurant full of people who chose to look away. Until one of them didn't. If you've ever waited for someone to finally say enough, this story is for you. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been Grant's idea. That alone should have told her something. Grant Holloway didn't take people to dinner. He summoned them. He performed generosity the way a magician performed card tricks, with just enough spectacle to distract you from where the real action was happening. Emma had known this for years. 12 years, if she was counting from the first time she watched him throw her mother's dinner plate against the kitchen wall because the pasta was oversalted. She'd been 12 then. She was 24 now, and she was sitting across from him in a white tablecloth restaurant called Elan on West 54th Street, listening to him order a $30 whiskey with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world owed him comfort. Her mother, Diane, sat between them, cutting her bread into smaller and smaller pieces she wouldn't eat. "You look tired," Grant said, not to Diane, to Emma. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you look tired." He swirled the whiskey the server had just placed in front of him. "There's a difference." Emma pressed her thumb against the edge of her fork under the table. The tines bit into the pad of her skin, not enough to break it, just enough to feel something concrete. A trick she'd developed somewhere around age 15. Physical pain was easier to manage than the other kind. Ellen was the kind of place that believed in atmosphere over warmth. Low brass lighting, dark wood paneling, white linen that probably cost more per yard than Emma made in a day at the bookstore. The other tables were populated with exactly the kind of people Emma had grown up watching from the outside. Couples who argued in quiet voices, executives winding down from something important, a birthday party in the back corner with champagne flutes catching the light. None of them were paying attention to the three of them. Emma had counted on that. She'd made a mistake coming. She'd known it before she walked through the door. Her body had told her. The low-grade nausea that settled in her stomach whenever she spent more than an hour in Grant's radius. The way her shoulders had already begun their slow migration toward her ears the moment she spotted his silver BMW idling outside her apartment building. But her mother had called that morning, and her voice had carried that particular fragility, that specific hollowness that meant things at the brownstone on Archer Street were bad, and Emma had not been able to say no. She never could. That was the whole problem, distilled into a single character defect. "Your mother tells me you're thinking about applying for some management position at that store," Grant said. He picked up his whiskey, studied it, set it back down. "Assistant manager of a bookshop, that's what we're aiming for." "It's a promotion. It's a consolation prize for someone who didn't try hard enough." Diane made a small sound beside him. Not quite a breath. Not quite a word. The sound of someone absorbing a blow they'd learned to anticipate. Emma kept her eyes on her own glass of water. The lemon slice had sunk to the bottom. She watched condensation track down the outside of the glass in a slow, crooked line, and thought about what she would cook for dinner when she got home. Thought about the novel she'd left face down on her nightstand, 200 pages in, already sure she knew how it ended. She thought about anything except Grant's voice, which was the vocal equivalent of gravel being dragged across asphalt. Low, grinding, designed to wear things down. Emma, her mother's voice barely above a murmur, a warning wrapped in maternal instinct. "I know," Emma said quietly. "You know what?" Grant said. She looked up. That was her second mistake of the evening. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone who had spotted something to correct. Grant was 53 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of red-faced, dissipating handsomeness that had probably been genuine once, before the alcohol got into the architecture of him. He kept his silver hair neat. His suits were always pressed. He maintained the surface appearance of a functional man, which was, Emma had come to understand, the most dangerous kind of performance. "I said I know the food here is good," Emma said. "Diane mentioned the sea bass." A beat, 2, 3. Grant picked up his whiskey and finished it in 2 swallows. "Don't do that," he said. Do what? That. The redirect. You do it every time I say something you don't like. You change the subject and make that face like you're the reasonable one. He set the glass down precisely, in the exact center of its ring on the tablecloth. It's insulting. Grant, Diane said, I'm not talking to you. The sentence had no particular volume to it. It didn't need to. It landed with the practiced accuracy of something said 10,000 times before, in 10,000 different kitchens and living rooms and hallways, until it had been reduced to its purest form. An instruction, not a sentence. Stop existing in this moment. I have not given you permission to speak. Diane's hands went still on her bread plate. Emma felt the heat rise behind her breastbone. She recognized it. She'd spent most of her adult life managing it, banking it down the way you bank a fire when you need it to last through a cold night. The anger was always there. She'd learned that expressing it only made things worse, only gave Grant a narrative to operate inside. Well, look at her. Hysterical, overreacting, you see what I deal with? So she held it. She always held it. The server came by. A young woman in her mid-20s, close to Emma's age, with efficient movements and the particular practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen 1,000 dinners exactly like this one. She refilled the water glasses, asked if they were ready to order, and disappeared again when Grant said they needed a few more minutes. Emma picked up her menu. The words blurred slightly. She blinked. She should go. She should look at her mother, telegraph something with her eyes, and they should both get up and walk out of this restaurant and never come back. She'd thought about this scenario more times than she could count. The clean, decisive exit, the moment of refusal. It lived in her head with extraordinary clarity, this other life where she and Diane walked out the door together and didn't stop walking. But then she looked at her mother's hands, the slight tremor in them, the way Diane held herself so carefully, like a person moving through a space full of invisible tripwires. Emma stayed. She stayed because her mother wasn't ready. She stayed because Grant controlled the brownstone Diane had lived in for 20 years, because Diane's name wasn't on the mortgage, because her mother's employment history had been systematically undermined over the course of a 2-decade marriage, until the idea of leaving felt less like liberation and more like free-falling off a building. Emma understood these things in the precise, granular way of someone who had spent years researching exits without ever using one. She ordered the pasta when it was her turn. Grant ordered another whiskey and the ribeye, rare. Diane ordered the smallest thing on the menu and apologized for the inconvenience. The restaurant filled up around them. The birthday party got louder. A jazz quartet set up in the far corner and began to play something soft and sophisticated that Emma couldn't name. The candle at the center of their table threw shifting shadows across Grant's face, and Emma watched him drink and thought about how much space a person could occupy without technically doing anything illegal. Then her phone buzzed. She reached for it automatically, and Grant's hand came across the table and covered hers. Not violently, not yet, just firmly. Enough. We're at dinner, he said. It might be the store. It's not the store. It's 9 o'clock at night. He didn't move his hand. Put it away. She put it away. She felt the familiar sick clenching in her gut. Not quite shame, not quite rage, something that lived in the basement of both emotions and refused to identify itself clearly. The evening continued. By the time the entrees arrived, Grant was on his third whiskey and operating in that particular register she knew better than anything. Not drunk, not sober, but suspended in the mean-tempered middle distance that was worse than either. His eyes had a flat quality to them. His voice had dropped half a register. He was moving through the meal the way a cold front moves through a valley. He criticized the ribeye. He sent it back. He made a comment about the server's efficiency loud enough for the table beside them to hear. He refilled his own glass from the bottle he'd ordered and dropped on the table between them like he was planting a flag. Emma ate her pasta without tasting it. Diane excused herself to the restroom and Emma watched her go and counted the seconds, because this was the window. This was always the window. The brief interval when Grant's attention had to recalibrate, when there was a slight loosening in whatever atmospheric pressure he exerted over every room he occupied. Emma had learned to use these windows carefully, to breathe inside them. She's getting worse, Grant said. Emma looked at him. Your mother, she's getting more fragile, she's not sleeping. He cut a piece of the returned ribeye, studied it. She cries at things. She dropped a cup last week and stood there apologizing to the floor for 30 seconds. He put the piece of meat in his mouth and chewed slowly. It's pathetic. She's anxious, Emma said carefully. I know why she's anxious. Then you know what would help. He looked up from the plate, the flat-eyed look. What was that? Emma's hand found the fork again under the table. The tines, the small pressure. I said she's been anxious for a long time and she probably needs support. That's not what you said. It was close enough. She held his gaze and did not look away and felt her heart doing something percussive and erratic behind her ribs. This was the other part of the window. The few seconds before Diane came back when the dynamic between them could briefly become something other than triangulated, when it was just the two of them and the long, unspoken negotiation they'd been running for 12 years. Emma was aware in this moment that she hated him, fully and without ambiguity. She didn't reach for it or indulge it. She just acknowledged it the way you acknowledge a weather system. This is what it is. This is what it does. There is no point in arguing with it. You always were too much like your father, Grant said, whatever he was, whoever he was. She'd made a mistake looking at him. She'd made a worse one speaking. I wouldn't know, she said. He left. Smart man. And then Diane was back, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone resettling a wound, and the window closed, and the table became a three-person arrangement again, and Emma returned to the business of getting through the next hour. She almost made it. The incident began not with a shout, but with stillness, the particular held breath quality that preceded bad weather. They were on dessert, which Emma wasn't eating, and Grant had finished the bottle, and Diane had made the error of asking the server for the check before Grant indicated he was ready to leave. A small thing. The kind of small thing that in a functional household would be nothing. A logistical miscommunication, a minor preference disagreement, immediately forgotten. But in the atmospheric conditions of a Grant Holloway evening, small things were not small. They were tests, and you had just failed one. I'll ask for the check, Grant said to Diane, with absolute quietness. I thought we were done. I'll ask for the check. Grant, she was just trying to... Emma started. He moved. She didn't see it as a deliberate decision. His hand came across the table and closed around her wrist. The right one, which was bad, because that was the worst one. And he turned it. Not hard enough to be assault and not gently enough to be anything other than what it was, and the sleeve of her blouse pulled back 2 inches, and the restaurant's candlelight found the bruising on the underside of her forearm that she'd been wearing for the past 8 days, and had stopped thinking about the way you stop thinking about wallpaper. Emma went still. The table beside them had gone quiet. The jazz quartet played something lilting and oblivious. Let go, Emma said, very quietly. Grant wasn't looking at her arm. He was looking at her face, and his expression was that particular configuration she recognized, the cold measuring thing he did when he was determining how much he could take and from whom and in what venue. I said let go, she said again. He didn't. What happened next happened in a sequence Emma would replay many times in the weeks and months that followed, in the way you replay a moment that divided your life into before and after. It didn't announce itself. There was no pause in the room's ambient noise. The birthday party in the back still laughed at something. Glasses still clinked. The server moved through the space with practiced invisibility. A man rose from a nearby table. She registered him peripherally at first. Height, dark suit. The particular way he moved through the restaurant's tight geography without bumping a single chair or disturbing a single table, which was unusual for a man of his size. He was tall, not an extraordinary height, but tall enough and built in a way that occupied space deliberately. His face was composed. Not angry, not theatrical. Composed in the way that certain things are composed, things that were built to withstand. He stopped at the edge of their table. Sir, he addressed Grant with the neutral tone of someone stating a fact. Let go of her arm. Grant looked up. In the yellow candlelight, his face was brick red, and his eyes were the color of old ice, and he said with complete equanimity, Mind your business. I am, the man said, minding it. Something moved through the table beside them. An older couple who had gone quiet mid-bite, their silverware suspended. A woman 2 tables further back with her hand over her mouth. Emma was aware of these peripheral observers with the hyperacute awareness of someone who has just become the center of a scene they have spent their entire life trying to avoid. Grant's grip on her wrist tightened marginally. A declaration. The man in the dark suit reached across and placed his hand over Grant's. Not violently. With the economy of motion of someone who had done physical things in his life and no longer needed to announce them in advance. He applied pressure, even, steady, expert pressure, to a specific point between the bones of Grant's hand. Grant let go. He made an involuntary sound, not quite pain, more surprise at its presence, and pulled his hand back and looked at it with an expression that was almost comical, the expression of a man who has spent years as the largest force in any room and has just encountered something larger. "Stand up," the man said. Still the same flat tone. No escalation. An instruction delivered to the air between them. "Who the hell? Stand up and we'll talk about this outside. I'm not going anywhere with you. Then you'll stay here and the next thing that happens will be in front of everyone in this restaurant." He paused. "Your choice, but make it quickly." Grant stood. Emma hadn't expected that. She thought she had run the scenario so quickly in her mind's eye that Grant would escalate, that he would make it loud, make it a spectacle, drag everyone into it on his terms. That was his operational preference, the crowded arena where he could control the narrative. But there was something in the other man's bearing that bypassed Grant's usual calculations. Something that went around the theatrical layers of Grant's self-presentation and addressed whatever was underneath directly. Grant stood and they walked, the taller man slightly behind and to the right, unhurried, toward the restaurant's front entrance. And Emma sat very still at the table, with her exposed wrist on the white tablecloth and her sleeve still pulled back and the bruising visible in the candlelight to anyone who looked, which was, she realized, everyone who was close enough, and which she had not consciously acknowledged in 3 weeks. Diane made a small sound. "I'm okay," Emma said, not because she was certain of it, but because the alternative to saying it was not saying it, and that felt like a thing she couldn't afford. Outside, through the restaurant's front window, she could see them, the 2 men on the pavement, in the amber wash of the street lighting. Grant was talking. She could see the aggressive geometry of his posture, the forward lean, the chin. And she could see the other man standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, entirely still. And somehow that stillness was more threatening than anything Grant was projecting. She watched Grant grab the other man's jacket. She watched what happened next with a clear, quiet sense of unreality. The other man moved once, in a way that was too quick and too precise for Emma to fully track. And then Grant was sitting on the pavement outside the restaurant with his back against the decorative planter beside the entrance. And the other man was standing above him, and nothing else was happening. Grant looked up from the ground with an expression that Emma, who had spent 12 years cataloging his emotional register with survival-level precision, had never seen on his face before. He looked genuinely uncertain. He looked like someone who had just run into a wall they hadn't known was there. Inside the restaurant, the birthday party kept going. The jazz quartet moved through its set. A server cleared a table, oblivious or professional enough to appear so. The man came back inside. He walked to their table, reached into his inside jacket pocket, and placed a business card on the white linen between Emma and her mother. He looked at Emma and not at Grant's empty chair. He looked at the bruises on her wrist. Not the way people usually looked at them when they saw them accidentally, with the quick, horrified glance away, but steadily, as you'd look at evidence. "His name's Grant Holloway," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma didn't answer. She didn't know how he knew the name, and she was briefly too disoriented to ask. "If he touches you again," the man said, "call that number. Any hour, any day." He glanced at Diane, something passing across his face that Emma couldn't read. "Both of you." Then he returned to his table, sat back down, picked up his drink. He did not look back at them. Emma looked at the card. It was a plain white card, heavy stock with a phone number and 2 words in clean serif type. Lucian Ashcroft. No title, no company, no email, just the name and the number, as if both were sufficient. Grant came back inside 2 minutes later. He walked to the table with the deliberate, controlled gait of a man reacquiring his composure, and he sat down, and he straightened his jacket, and he said nothing. He looked at neither Emma nor Diane. He looked at the candle, and his jaw worked once and then went still. Emma became aware, in the silence that followed, that something had shifted, not fixed. Nothing in the fundamental architecture of the situation had changed. Grant was still Grant. The brownstone still existed. Her mother's name was still absent from every document that mattered, but something in the equilibrium had moved, like a bone resetting, painful, structural, necessary. She pulled her sleeve down, she picked up the card, she put it in her coat pocket against the seam, where it sat with the density of something heavier than cardboard. Grant called for the check himself, in silence. The server brought it, and he paid without theater, and they stood and gathered their things, and the three of them walked out of the restaurant into the October cold. The planter by the entrance was just a planter again. The pavement was just pavement. On the sidewalk, Grant took Diane's arm with the proprietary grip of someone reclaiming an object, and Diane went because that's what 12 years of this had made her. And Emma stood on the street and watched them walk toward the car and felt the card in her pocket like a coal. Emma. Grant without turning. A summons. She didn't move. He stopped. Turned. In the orange streetlight, his face was unreadable. You coming? She stood on the sidewalk outside a lawn on West 54th Street on a Tuesday night in October with traffic moving past, and her coat buttoned against the cold, and she felt something very clear and very unfamiliar moving through her chest. It wasn't courage exactly. It was more primitive than that. The sound a thing makes when it finally breaks along a line it's been developing for years. No, Emma said. Grant blinked. He actually blinked, the way you blink when you've misheard something. What? I'm not coming. She watched him recalibrate. She watched him assess the street, the distance, the restaurant entrance behind her, the public nature of the moment. She watched him make the calculation that had always been available to him and that he had always in private been exempt from needing to make. This isn't the time for... Mom. Emma looked past him, at Diane, who was watching from beside the car with an expression Emma couldn't fully categorize. Fear, yes, but something else underneath it, something attentive, something almost held. You can come with me if you want. Diane's mouth opened, closed. Grant said her name. Just her name. One syllable in that register. And Diane's gaze went to the pavement, and Emma felt the familiar collapse of the scenario. The way this always went, the way it had always gone, the way she had always told herself this time would be different, and it was never different. Her mother got into the car. Emma stood on the sidewalk and watched the door close and watched the car pull out into traffic and watched the taillights shrink toward the intersection. She did not move for a long time. When she finally did, she didn't go back into the restaurant. She walked. Direction had nothing to do with the decision. Movement did. She walked north along the avenue with the card in her pocket and the cold coming up off the pavement and the buildings lit and indifferent on either side of her, and she let the anger and the grief and the particular species of helpless guilt she'd spent 12 years cultivating run through her like water through a cracked pipe. Not controlled, not managed, not banked down for later. Just present, just real. Her phone buzzed. Grant's name on the screen. She silenced it without looking at it fully. She walked 4 more blocks before she stopped under a street lamp and took the card out of her pocket and looked at it again in the yellow light. Lucienne Ashcroft. The serif type. The phone number. She turned it over. Blank. She held it between her thumb and forefinger and tried to organize what she knew about the man it belonged to, which was essentially nothing. His name, his face, the efficiency with which he'd applied pressure to a specific point in Grant's hand, the flatness of his voice, the way he'd looked at her wrist, not with pity, not with the kind of performative discomfort that people used to protect themselves from having to act, with the look of someone assessing a situation and determining what could be done about it. She thought about calling the number. Then she thought about calling the other number, the one in her phone under the contact name she'd saved 3 months ago after doing 45 minutes of research on her lunch break, the women's shelter on the east side that she'd never dialed. She stood there under the street lamp for 9 minutes. She counted them. Then she called the shelter. The voice that answered was matter-of-fact and warm in equal measure. Her name wasn't asked for immediately. The first question was whether she was safe right now, in this moment. Emma said yes. The woman on the phone said good. She said to take her time. Emma stood under the street lamp and the October city moved around her, and she told a stranger on the phone more of the truth in the next 6 minutes than she had told anyone in the last 12 years. When she hung up, she had a time and an address for the following morning. She put the shelter's number and Lucienne's card back into her coat pocket, side by side. She stood for another moment in the light, breathing. Her reflection caught in the dark window of the closed business behind her. A young woman with her coat belted tight and her face tilted up slightly, as though testing the air for something. She looked like someone at a beginning. She hadn't identified it yet. She hadn't had the language. She walked to the subway and went home to her apartment and sat on the edge of her bed for a while without turning on the light. And she thought about her mother in the car, and about the sound a bone makes when it resets, and about a man who had stood up in a room full of people who had chosen not to. She did not sleep well, but she slept. That was something. That was more than Tuesday night had promised when it started. 3 days later, she was shelving the new fiction arrivals at the back of Harding and Clay booksellers on Amsterdam Avenue when she looked up and found Lucien Tichous Ian Ashcroft standing 15 feet away, examining the biography section with apparent genuine interest. She stopped with a copy of a debut novel half-shelved in her hand and stared at him for a moment before he looked up. He registered her without surprise, which was its own kind of disorienting. "You're following me," she said. She said it directly, without preamble, because the situation seemed to call for directness, and she had, over the past 72 hours, been developing an uncharacteristic appetite for it. "I'm looking at a book." He held it up, a biography of a mid-century diplomat she recognized from the publisher catalog. "Though I admit the location isn't entirely coincidental." "That's following." He put the book back on the shelf carefully, spine aligned. "I've been monitoring Grant Holloway's movements. His address is 3 blocks from here." He said this with the flat informational quality he seemed to apply to everything. "I wanted to make sure he hadn't redirected his attention." Emma finished shelving the novel. She kept her hands busy because it gave her something to do with the complicated set of feelings that arose when she tried to process what he'd just said. "You've been monitoring him," she repeated. "Is that alarming?" "I don't know yet." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that lived entirely in the eyes, brief and dry. "Fair answer." "Why?" Emma said. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the bookstore conducted its afternoon business. A mother with a stroller browsing the children's section. A college student asleep over a textbook at one of the reading tables. The quiet percussion of a keyboard from the register up front. "I know what I saw at the restaurant," he said. "Sometimes that's enough." Emma looked at him. She was a practiced reader of people. You develop that skill in self-defense, growing up in the atmospheric conditions of a Grant Holloway household, and she studied him the way she'd study an unfamiliar text, trying to find the subtext, the angle, the thing underneath the surface presentation that would tell her what he actually wanted. She found it harder than usual. "My manager's going to wonder why I'm having a conversation in the biography section," she said. "Then have dinner with me instead," he said. "Somewhere public. Somewhere you choose." "I don't know anything about you." "You know my name and my phone number, and that I can remove a man's hand from someone's wrist without causing permanent injury." He paused. "Most people know far less about the people they agree to have dinner with." "Most people haven't had the week I've had." "No," he said. "They haven't." She looked at him for another moment. Outside the bookstore window, Amsterdam Avenue moved through its mid-afternoon rhythms. A bus pulling away from the stop, a delivery truck double-parked, 2 women with coffee cups gesturing at each other over something urgent and probably minor. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He bought the diplomat biography. She rang him up at the register and did not make small talk, and he did not push for any, and he left the store with the book tucked under one arm and walked south, and she watched through the window until the crowd absorbed him. Her coworker Marcus appeared at her elbow with a returns cart and said, "Who was that?" "A customer," Emma said. Marcus looked at the door where Lucien had exited. "He looked at you the whole time he was in here, like—" He searched for the right comparison. "Like someone watching a building they're considering buying." "That's a strange thing to say." "It was a strange thing to witness." Marcus pushed the returns cart away. "Just saying." Emma stood at the register for a moment longer, then went back to shelving the new fiction. She was on the last book when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The restaurant 3 blocks south of your store. Tomorrow at 7, if you want to." She stared at it for a full minute. Then she typed one word back. "Okay." She wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. The dinner, the conversation, The departure from the kind of carefully maintained low-profile existence she'd operated inside for years, moving through her days on an axis of work-apartment obligation, keeping her head down, her sleeves down, her mother's situation contained within the specific vocabulary of managing it. She wasn't managing it anymore. She'd stopped managing it the moment she'd said no on the sidewalk outside Elan, and she could feel that something shifting loose from its moorings, something structural, something that had defined the shape of her days for so long she'd stopped recognizing it as a cage and started calling it a habit. She put her phone back in her apron pocket and finished the shelving cart, and clocked out at 6 and walked home through the fading October light with her hands in her pockets and the sound of the city coming up through her shoes. And she thought that she had no idea what she was doing or where any of this was going. But for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she was curious to find out. She was halfway up the stairs to her apartment when her own phone rang, her mother's name on the screen. She answered, silence first, then breathing. Then Diane's voice, very quiet, with that particular quality that Emma had learned to recognize with the accuracy of a trained instrument, the voice she used when Grant was somewhere close. "He came home late," Diane said. "He's in a mood." Emma stopped on the landing, her hand tightened on the phone. "Mom, I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." Emma pressed her back against the wall of the stairwell. "Mom, listen to me. I need you to. I should go." The urgency in it beneath the quiet, the specific urgency of someone ending a call before a door opens. "I'll call tomorrow." The line went dead. Emma stood in the stairwell with her phone in her hand, and the apartment above her waiting, and the night coming down outside, and the particular cold clarity of a decision not yet made but already inevitable, moving toward her like a weather front she could feel in her joints but could not yet see. She thought about calling Lucian's number. She thought about calling the shelter again. She thought about her mother's voice, that specific register, the one she used when the house was dangerous and she was pretending otherwise. She thought about the dinner tomorrow, about the book he'd bought, about Marcus saying like someone watching a building they're considering buying, which was strange, but also, in some way she couldn't quite articulate, felt less like surveillance and more like her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Not Lucian. A different one. A Manhattan area code she didn't recognize. She answered. Static first, then a man's voice, low and unhurried. "Miss Whitlock?" Not a question. He knew who had answered. "Who is this?" A pause. "Someone who has a mutual acquaintance with a man named Lucien Ashcroft," the voice said, "and a friendly piece of advice for you, before you get in too deep." Emma's hand tightened on the phone. "Whoever that man told you he is," the voice said, "he's only half right." Emma stood in the stairwell for another 4 seconds with the phone pressed against her ear, listening to the empty air where the voice had been. Then she hung up. She stood very still. The stairwell smelled like old carpet, and the takeout someone on the second floor had ordered an hour ago. The overhead bulb buzzed with the faint, irregular frequency that the landlord had been promising to fix for 3 months. She was aware of all of these things with precise sensory clarity. The specific quality of attention that arrives when something has just shifted the ground under you and your body hasn't caught up to processing what yet. "Whoever that man told you he is, he's only half right." She went upstairs. She locked the door behind her. She stood in the middle of her apartment in her coat with her keys still in her hand and looked at the specific, unremarkable details of the room she'd lived in for 2 years. The books stacked on every surface, the reading chair by the window with its arm-worn pail, the coffee mug from this morning still on the counter, and tried to organize what she was feeling into something usable. She couldn't. She put her keys on the hook. She hung up her coat. She sat down in the reading chair without turning on the additional lamp and let the low evening light come through the window and thought about the call. The voice had been calm. No threat in it, no urgency, nothing that pushed, just the flat delivery of someone stating a known fact, which was, in Emma's experience, considerably more unsettling than if it had been theatrical. Theatrical she knew. Theatrical was Grant's register. The raised voice, the slow escalation, the performance of anger deployed strategically. This had been none of that. This had been the conversational tone of someone who believed they had something you needed to hear and was not particularly invested in whether you believed them. She thought about calling Lucien. She thought about not calling Lucien. She thought about calling the unknown number back. She did none of these things. She sat in the chair until the light was fully gone, and then she got up and made tea. She didn't drink, and went to bed and lay in the dark with her eyes open and her mother's voice running on a loop somewhere behind her thoughts. I should go. I'll call tomorrow. And the particular quality of the silence after the line cut out. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. The restaurant Lucien had texted her about was called Sable, and it was not the kind of place she would have chosen herself, which was probably the point. A narrow room in the West 50s, 12 tables at most, the lighting set low enough to be intimate without being conspiratorial. The kind of place where the servers knew the regulars' drink orders before they sat down, and the menu didn't have prices, because if you needed to ask, the address on the reservation was a mistake. Emma arrived 7 minutes early and told herself this was not a statement. She sat at the table and ordered water and looked at the room. 12 tables, 2 emergency exits, the front she'd come through, and what appeared to be a kitchen egress at the rear behind a half wall. 7 other diners currently seated. No one she recognized. No one paying particular attention to her. She was doing this, cataloging exits, scanning faces, and registering the fact that she was doing it, which was new. She'd always had the reflex, the low-level threat assessment that came from growing up in an environment where you needed to know where the doors were. But she'd never before caught herself running it consciously, like a process she'd chosen rather than one installed by circumstance. Lucien came in at exactly 7. He spotted her immediately, which meant he'd looked for her, and moved through the room with the same unhurried efficiency she'd clocked at Elan. He sat down across from her, shrugged out of his jacket, and picked up the menu without theater. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say things." He looked at the menu. "They don't always follow through." Emma put her hands in her lap under the table. "Someone called me last night after you left the store." He looked up from the menu. "Unknown number," she said. "Male voice. He told me you were only half of what you say you are." Lucien set the menu down. He did it with care, aligning it with the edge of the table, and then he looked at her with the same steady, evidence-assessing quality he'd brought to her bruised wrist in the restaurant, and he said nothing for a moment. "Did he give a name?" he said. "No." "Describe the voice." "Calm, unhurried, no accent I could place." She watched his face. "You know who it was?" "I have a working hypothesis." His jaw moved once. "I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened. What shouldn't have happened is someone calling my personal number with a warning about a man I'd met once." She kept her voice level. "How did he get my number? If I'm right about who it is, he has access to things he shouldn't." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite anger, more contained than that. The particular look of someone reacquiring a problem they thought they'd put a distance between themselves and... His name would be Victor Serrano, and if it was him, the call wasn't friendly advice. It was positioning. Positioning for what? The server came. They ordered. Lucien ordered without looking at the menu again, from memory, which told Emma he'd been here before. She ordered the first thing she'd identified as uncomplicated and wouldn't require her full attention to eat because her full attention was already occupied. When the server left, Lucien turned his water glass in his hands once and said, "How much do you want to know?" Emma looked at him. "Everything that's relevant. Some of it may change how you feel about sitting here." "I'm already sitting here." He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them with its discreet, curated warmth. "My family built an import-export business starting in the mid-'80s, he said. "My father built it, and for the first decade or so it was legitimate. Freight, logistics, distribution. There are photographs of him at ribbon cuttings, shaking hands with city officials, the whole performance." He paused, and then the business changed. The logistics network became useful for other things. The people my father did business with changed, and then the business was something else entirely while still looking, from the outside, like a logistics company. "Organized crime," Emma said. "That's the clean version of it, yes." "And the less clean version?" He met her eyes directly. My father moved product, money, and occasionally people across borders for organizations that had the kind of authority that comes from making problems disappear. He did it successfully for 20 years. When he died, I inherited the company and the relationships and the debt structure that made leaving those relationships a complex proposition. Emma absorbed this. How complex? Complex enough that I spent 3 years restructuring before I could begin cutting ties without precipitating the kind of response that ends careers or people. He said people flatly, without inflection, as though it were not the most significant word in the sentence. Victor Serrano was my father's primary partner on the Eastern Seaboard operations. He believes, with some historical justification, that the business was built on a structure he helped architect, and he does not accept that I have the right to dismantle what he helped build. Emma was quiet for a moment. And do you have the right? He looked at her steadily. It's my company, my name, my choice to make. That's not what I asked. Something shifted in his face. It was slight, brief. The micro-expression of someone recalibrating their read of the person across the table from them. Legally, yes, he said. Morally, that's a harder conversation. Why? Because I benefited from what my father did. I was educated with that money. I lived well because of that money. I didn't know, early on, the full nature of it, and by the time I did know, I'd already been the beneficiary for long enough that claiming clean hands would be its own kind of dishonesty. He picked up his water glass. So I'm not claiming clean hands. I'm claiming that I'm trying to build something cleaner. That's a different thing. Emma looked at him for a long moment. The candle between them threw its unsteady light. And Serrano called me to warn me away from you. He called you to demonstrate that he can reach you, Lucien said. The content was secondary. The message was that he knows you exist, knows your number, and knows that you spent time with me. That's what he wanted you to understand. The food arrived. They ate without speaking for a minute, which Emma had not expected to be comfortable, and was, slightly, which unsettled her in a different way than everything else had. Why did you come to the restaurant that night? She said. Alain, you weren't there by accident. I was there by accident, he said. I was having dinner. I wasn't following you. I didn't know you existed before that night. But you knew Grant's name the next morning. I had someone find it. No hesitation. After the restaurant. I wanted to know who he was. Why? He set down his fork, looked at her with that directness again, the quality of it slightly unsettling in its consistency. Most people, in Emma's experience, delivered their eye contact in varying quantities depending on the difficulty of what they were saying. Lucien seemed to apply the same steady quantity to everything. Because I know what that looked like, he said, and I know what comes after it if no one pays attention. A pause, something in the way he'd said it. Personal experience, Emma said. Not a question. My mother, he said. Not my father, if you're assembling the obvious picture. My father's behavior was mostly reserved for business. A different man came into our lives when I was 11. He was gone by the time I was 14, but he picked his fork back up. 3 years is enough to know what it looks like. Emma sat with this for a moment. What happened to him? He left, Lucien said. Under pressure, I applied, to the extent a 14-year-old can apply pressure, which is less than I wished at the time. A pause. More than nothing. She thought about a 14-year-old doing whatever he'd been able to do. She thought about her own 12-year-old self watching a plate hit a kitchen wall and deciding the safest thing to do was nothing. I wanted to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The efficiency, the restaurant, and then what you did outside. She held his gaze. Where does that come from? And I want a real answer, not a resume. He almost smiled again. It went to the same place it had gone in the bookstore. The eyes, briefly. My 20s were complicated, he said. When I understood what the company actually was, I understood I needed to know things I didn't know. How environments turn hostile. How people move in spaces where violence is a possibility. I learned from people who knew, and I practiced until it became reflex. He paused. It's not heroic. It's contingency planning. Most people don't contingency plan like that. Most people don't inherit what I inherited. The dinner continued. Emma asked questions and he answered them, and she watched for the gaps, the places where the story turned slightly, where a careful rephrase appeared that might indicate the management of information rather than the sharing of it. She found fewer of them than she expected. What she found instead was the texture of someone who had spent years building a relationship with the truth that was more nuanced than simply telling it or hiding it. Someone who had learned to say, "I don't know," and that's more complicated than I can answer cleanly, as alternatives to the more convenient simplifications. It wasn't reassurance, but it was, she thought, something. They were on coffee when her phone buzzed on the table between them. She saw the screen, her mother's name. She answered immediately. Mom. Silence. The particular quality of held silence. Mom. Her voice tightened. Talk to me. A breath. Then barely above a whisper. He found the paperwork. Emma went still. Across from her, she felt rather than saw Lucian's attention sharpen. What paperwork? She said, though she knew. She knew before Diane answered. The shelter information, Diane said. The printout. I thought I'd hidden it. Her voice was doing the thing, the controlled quiet of someone speaking precisely because precision was the only form of safety currently available. He's very angry, Emma. Are you hurt? Not yet. The yet landed with the weight of something she'd been carrying for years. He went out. He said he'd be back. Listen to me. Emma was already doing the mental calculation. Subway to Archer Street was 22 minutes minimum. Car would be faster, but she didn't have one. Cab was variable. I'm coming. I need you to go somewhere in the house that locks. The bathroom. Take your phone. Emma, Mom, bathroom, lock, now. A pause. Then the small sound of movement. He'll be back in an hour, Diane said. Maybe less. I'll be there before that. She was already pushing back from the table. Don't open the door for anyone until I call you back. She hung up. Looked at Lucien. He was already picking up his jacket. You don't have to, she started. I have a car 2 blocks from here, he said. Archer Street is 40 blocks north. We can be there in 12 minutes. She looked at him for one moment. The specific quality of the moment, its weight, what accepting it would mean. And then she said, let's go. The car was a dark sedan with a driver named Rael, who did not ask questions and navigated the mid-evening traffic with the competence of someone for whom urgency was a regular condition. Emma sat in the back with her phone in her hand and her jaw tight and watched the city move past the window while Lucien sat beside her and made one call in a low voice, in English, that she couldn't fully parse, but which appeared to involve instructions to someone who knew who Grant Holloway was and where he currently was. You have people watching him, Emma said when he hung up. I had people keep track of his patterns after the restaurant, Lucien said. He left the Archer Street house 40 minutes ago. Current location is a bar on 183rd Street. He paused. He's been there for 35 minutes. Emma stared at him. You've been tracking him? Yes. Without telling me. I didn't know how to bring it up in the bookstore. He held her gaze. I'm telling you now. She turned back to the window. 12 years of Grant Holloway had given her an extensive vocabulary for the specific anger she felt right now. Not clean anger, not simple outrage, but the complicated, contaminated kind that came from knowing someone had done something presumptuous and possibly necessary at the same time, and not being able to cleanly assign it to one category. Next time, she said, tell me. Yes, he said. No qualification, no defense. They pulled onto Archer Street at 7 minutes past 8. The brownstone was the 4th from the corner, a narrow, red-faced building with a light on in the second-floor window that Emma knew was the bedroom. The front stoop was empty. She was out of the car before it fully stopped. She had her key out. She went up the stoop and through the front door and up the interior stairs with her heart doing the thing it always did in this building. The accelerated, heavy rhythm that 12 years of conditioning had written into her body's response to this address. And she knocked on the bathroom door at the end of the second-floor hall. Mom, it's me. The lock turned. The door opened. Diane was sitting on the edge of the tub in her work clothes, shoes still on, with her phone in her lap, and her face carrying that specific arrangement of features Emma had seen 1,000 times and never stopped finding devastating. The careful blankness that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of too much of it. Emma crouched in front of her. Are you okay? I'm okay. Diane's eyes moved to the hall behind Emma. Who's? A friend. Emma took her mother's hands. They were cold. Mom, you can't stay here tonight. You know that. Diane looked at their joined hands. This is my home. I know. 22 years of... I know. Emma kept her voice level, not gentle. She'd learned that gentle sometimes gave Diane room to talk herself back into staying, but clear. Factual. I have the shelter's number. I talked to them 2 days ago. There's a space. Emma, or you come to my apartment tonight. Either way, you're not here when he comes back. Diane's eyes filled. She blinked, and the tears tracked, and she made an impatient gesture at them, brushing them away with the backs of both hands, which was so characteristic, her mother's frustration with her own emotion, the lifelong habit of apologizing for feeling, that Emma had to look away for a moment at the bathroom wall. From downstairs, the sound of the front door. Both of them went still. Diane's hand gripped Emma's wrist. Steps in the entry. Heavier than usual. Not the carefully moderated performance of normalcy that Grant sometimes deployed when he was building pressure. These steps had the blunt, imprecise quality of someone not moderating anything. He'd come back early. Emma stood. She positioned herself between her mother and the bathroom door. Automatic, instinctive, the same positioning she'd learned at 12. She heard him on the stairs. She heard him stop on the landing. Diane! The voice through the door, flat, no temperature in it. Emma said nothing. Diane made no sound. I can see the light under the door. A pause. Open it. Emma looked at her mother. Diane was sitting very straight on the edge of the tub with her hands in her lap and her face set in an expression Emma could read precisely. The specific courage of someone who has run out of alternatives and is now operating on what remains when alternatives are gone. Emma opened the door. Grant stood in the hallway with his jacket still on, and his face carrying the particular flatness of someone 2 drinks past their threshold in the direction of the wrong kind of quiet. He looked at Emma, then at Diane behind her, then back at Emma. You, he said. Me, she said. He looked past her at Diane. What did you tell her? That you found the paperwork, Emma said. That's enough. His jaw shifted. This is between me and your mother. Not anymore. Something moved in his face. He stepped forward, and Emma did not move, and he stopped. He had 2 inches of height and easily 70 pounds on her, and they both knew it, and Emma could feel the specific arithmetic of the standoff in her chest, the way physical reality imposed itself on intention, the way courage had to be recalculated at every step when the body was doing its honest accounting. You need to leave, Grant said. We're both leaving, Emma said, all 3 of us. A pause. His eyes flicked over her shoulder at Diane. You're not going anywhere, he said. Grant, Diane started. I told you that paperwork was... Grant, Emma's voice cutting across. Stop talking to her and look at me. He looked at her, the flat, old ice eyes, the jaw moving once. There's a man downstairs, Emma said. He's been outside for 4 minutes, and he has documentation of every time you've put your hands on either one of us, going back 8 months. If I don't text him in the next 60 seconds, he calls the people he's already been speaking with. She held his gaze without deviation. So you can make this loud, or you can let us get our things, but this is the last conversation we're ever going to have in this hallway. Silence. Grant looked at her. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing, the same calculation he'd done on the pavement outside Elan, the threat assessment, the evaluation of what she was and wasn't bluffing. He looked past her again at Diane, at his wife of 20 years sitting on the edge of the bathtub in her work clothes with her hands in her lap, and her face the particular careful blank of a woman who has decided something. Something went out of Grant's posture, not collapse, nothing that complete or clean, but a structural deflation, like a building losing one of its load-bearing assumptions. He stepped back from the doorway. He turned and walked to the end of the hall and put his hand on the banister and stood there with his back to them. Emma looked at her mother. Diane stood. She picked up nothing from the bathroom. No overnight bag, no necessities. She would come back for things later, or she would send for them, or she would leave them. The specifics could be organized when they were out of the building. She walked out of the bathroom, past Emma, into the hall, past Grant's back at the top of the stairs. She did not look at him. Emma followed. They were 3 steps down when Grant said, very quietly, "This isn't finished." Emma kept walking. They came out through the front door into the street. Lucien was standing on the pavement beside the car, and one other man Emma didn't recognize stood a few feet further along the block with the casual posture of someone who wasn't quite doing nothing. Lucien looked at Diane first, then at Emma. "Okay?" he said. "We're okay," Emma said. He opened the car door and Diane got in, and Emma started to follow and stopped. She turned and looked back at the brownstone, the light in the second-floor window, the front door still closed, the narrow red face of the building she'd grown up hating and returning to over and over, because love and damage were not, in her experience, mutually exclusive categories. And because leaving required the kind of completeness of conviction that was hard to maintain when the evidence against Stain was theoretical and the pull of the familiar was entirely, exhaustingly real. The pull wasn't entirely gone, even now. That was the true thing she couldn't quite say out loud, that walking away from this address, this time, this night, her mother beside her, someone's car waiting at the curb, did not produce the clean, cinematic flood of liberation she'd imagined during the years she'd planned it. What it produced was something more complicated. Grief for the version of this that might have been. Exhaustion so deep it had its own specific weight, and underneath all of it, quiet and cold and clear as the October air, the recognition that complicated did not mean wrong. She got in the car. They pulled away from Archer Street, and Emma watched the brownstone recede in the side mirror until the block turned and it was gone. And then she sat back and looked at her hands in her lap, and she became aware after a moment that her mother was crying silently beside her. Not the anguished crying of crisis, but the slow, private crying of someone setting something down that they've been carrying for a very long time, which is a different thing entirely and almost harder to witness. Emma took her mother's hand. They rode in silence through the city. It wasn't until they'd delivered Diane to the shelter and Emma had sat with the intake coordinator for 40 minutes and walked her mother to the room she'd be in for tonight and hugged her for a long time in the doorway. Her mother, who smelled like the same soap she'd used for 20 years and who felt smaller than Emma remembered her being. Or maybe that was just the absence of the performance of holding herself upright in a house that required it, that Emma came back out to find Lucien waiting in the lobby. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly, not dismissing it, just not requiring it. They came out into the street. It was almost 11. The city had shifted into its later register. Quieter, not quiet. The sounds different in quality. Emma stood on the pavement and took a breath and let it out slowly. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead. The federal investigators." She watched his face. "You're already talking to them, aren't you? About Serrano and the rest of it." He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Lucien." "Yes," he said. "I have been. For a while now." Emma looked at him, at the streetlight catching the planes of his face, at the particular quality of stillness he had, which she'd originally read as composure, but was now beginning to understand was something slightly different, the stillness of someone who had made a decision of enormous weight and was living in the aftermath of it, which required a kind of daily steadiness that went beyond temperament. "So when Serrano called me," she said slowly, "he already knew you were cooperating." "He suspected," Lucien said. "The call to you was to confirm whether I was attaching personal complications to the situation, whether I had something that could be used as leverage against me." A pause. Something that could be threatened. Emma stood with this for a moment. The October cold came off the pavement and the buildings, and she could feel it through her coat now. A low, ambient chill that had been there all evening and that she was only just registering because she'd run warm through all of it on adrenaline and focus. "So by being near you," she said, "I have already become a target." He didn't try to reroute the sentence. "It's possible," he said. "I want you to understand that before anything else." She thought about this call last night. The calm voice. The specific, unhurried delivery of someone who wanted her to understand that he knew she existed. She thought about her mother tonight, in a shelter room for the first time in 20 years of wanting to leave. She thought about the 12-year-old version of herself deciding that the safest thing to do was nothing, and the 24-year-old version of herself saying no on a sidewalk while a car pulled away. "I've been a target in my own house my whole life," Emma said. "At least now I know the threat has a name." Lucien looked at her. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite the almost smile, something older and less contained than that. Her phone rang. She pulled it out. Unknown numbered, but not the one from last night, different last 4 digits. She answered. Silence. Then a sound she recognized. Her mother's breathing. Wrong. Too fast. Too shallow. Mom? You're at the shelter. What? I'm not at the shelter. Diane's voice. Very small. He was there when I came out of the intake room. He was waiting in the lobby, Emma. I don't know how he knew. The line cut out. Emma looked at the phone in her hand, looked at Lucian. He has someone inside the shelter, she said, and felt the ground shift under everything they had built tonight into something that required a completely different kind of steadiness than what she'd been operating on. Something she wasn't sure she had, and would have to find anyway, because the alternative was her mother alone in the city, with a man who had just demonstrated that there was no door she could close, that he couldn't find his way to the other side of. Lucien was already on his phone before Emma finished the sentence. He spoke in the clipped, sequential shorthand of someone issuing instructions to people who didn't require explanation. 3 sentences, a pause to receive confirmation, 2 more sentences. And then he lowered the phone and looked at Emma with the focused, operational quality she was beginning to recognize as his version of urgency. It didn't look like panic. It looked like a machine shifting gears. Rael's still on the block, he said. We need to go back inside. My mother is in the building. Grant can't take her out of a shelter without creating a scene that brings staff. He's applying pressure, not executing a plan. He held the door. We go back in, we find her, we move her somewhere he doesn't know about. But we need to do it in the next few minutes, before he decides the lobby isn't working. Emma went back through the door. The shelter lobby was a functional, fluorescent-lit room that managed to be both institutional and carefully humanized. A mural on one wall done by what appeared to be the resident children, a rack of donated coats by the entrance, 2 sofas that didn't match but were clean. The intake coordinator who'd processed Diane 45 minutes ago was standing at the far end of the reception desk with her arms crossed and her face carrying the expression of someone managing a situation they'd managed versions of before. Grant was not in the lobby. Emma scanned the room, a woman with 2 small children on one sofa, the children asleep, the mother not. A man in a security uniform by the inner door who was young and clearly uncomfortable. No Grant. Where is he? Emma said to the coordinator, whose name tag read Yvette. He left 2 minutes ago, Yvette said. She was a large woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the bearing of someone who had not been surprised in a professional context for a decade. When I told him there was no one here by that name and that this facility did not confirm or deny residence, he stood there for a while and then left. He had someone tell him she was here. Yvette's expression moved slightly. That's a serious allegation. I'm not alleging anything. He knew she was here 20 minutes after she arrived. Either he followed us, which I'd have seen, or someone told him. Emma held the woman's gaze. I need to know which one. A pause. Yvette looked at Lucian. The brief, assessing look of someone determining what category of person they were dealing with, and then back at Emma. There's a protocol for this, she said. I need to make some calls. Make them, Emma said. But first tell me where my mother is. Diane was in a back room off the main corridor, a staff break room with a table and 4 chairs and a coffee maker, sitting across from a younger staff member who'd clearly been tasked with keeping her company. She looked up when Emma came in, and the specific relief in her face was so complete and unguarded that it was almost painful to look at directly. Emma sat across from her. Are you hurt? No. Diane shook her head. He came in and stood there and looked at me and didn't say anything for, 30 seconds. And then he said my name, just my name, and then the woman at the desk came over. She stopped, put both hands flat on the table. How did he know, Emma? I don't know yet. He always knows. Diane said it with the flat exhaustion of a woman reciting a fact she's tested repeatedly and always found true. He has always known. Every time I made a plan, every time I talked to someone, he knew. She looked at her hands on the table. I used to think I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it. I know that now. A pause. I've known it for years. I just needed there to be another explanation. Lucian appeared in the doorway. He looked at Emma. Yvette found something. The something was a phone, a staff member, a young man who'd been with the organization for 4 months, who worked intake 2 evenings a week, who had, Yvette explained with the controlled fury of someone maintaining professionalism, by an act of will. Accepted $200 in cash 2 weeks ago to pass along information about residents to a contact number he'd been given. He hadn't known who the number belonged to. He told himself it was a concerned family member. He told himself various things that had allowed him to do it 3 times before tonight. He was sitting in Yvette's office when Emma came in, and he was young, 22 at most, with the underdeveloped face of someone who hadn't yet learned that the consequences of decisions arrived whether or not you'd fully thought them through. He looked at Emma and then quickly away. Emma stood in the center of the room and looked at him and felt the anger move through her like something tidal. Not the hot, proximate anger of a direct confrontation, but the cold, structural anger of someone understanding that the vulnerability she'd spent her adult life trying to protect had been available for purchase at $200 a transaction. "Did you know what kind of situation you were feeding information into?" she said. He looked at the desk. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. "Did you know?" "He said he was her husband," the young man said. His voice had the defensive, trailing quality of someone who understood the inadequacy of what they were saying while they were saying it. "He said she'd left without telling him where she was going, and he was worried." "That's what they always say," Emma said. "That's the exact sentence. That's the first sentence every time." She stopped herself, took a breath. "The number he gave you, do you still have it?" He did. He had it in his phone, and Lucien photographed it, and Emma looked at it and didn't recognize it, but watched Lucien's jaw do the thing it did when he was integrating information he didn't like. They left the young man to Yvette's handling and stood in the corridor, and Lucien showed her the number on his phone screen. "It's not Grant's number," Emma said. "No," Lucien said. "It's not." She looked at him. "Serrano. That would be my read." He put the phone away. "Which means Grant and Serrano have made contact. Which means this stopped being 2 separate problems sometime in the last 48 hours. Emma stood in the fluorescent corridor of the shelter with the particular quality of mental vertigo that comes from watching a situation expand beyond its previously known boundaries. She'd walked into tonight with a map. Grant, the shelter, her mother, the manageable geography of a domestic situation, however dangerous. The map was no longer accurate. "Why would Serrano care about Grant?" she said. "He doesn't," Lucien said. "He cares about having a mechanism. Grant wants your mother and wants leverage over you. Serrano wants leverage over me. They've found a use for each other." He said it without inflection, the way you'd describe a weather pattern. "It's practical, not complicated." "It's very complicated," Emma said. "From where you're standing. From where they're standing, it's elegant." She looked at the wall, looked back at him. "We need to move my mother tonight." "Yes, somewhere neither of them knows about." "Yes, I have a place. It's clean. Nothing connected to my name or the company." He paused. "You'd need to trust me with that." Emma looked at him for a moment. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, and she could see the tiredness in his face. Not the performance of tiredness, the real version, the kind that came from operating inside a sustained situation with high stakes for a long time. She recognized it because she saw it in the mirror with some regularity. "Tell me the address," she said, "and I'll decide." He told her. She put it in her phone. She texted it to a number she'd set up when she'd first started researching exits. A secure secondary number that Grant didn't have, so that the address existed somewhere outside her immediate control. Lucien watched her do this without comment, and she appreciated the absence of comment. "Okay," she said. "Let's move her." The place was a furnished apartment in a building in Inwood, at the top of Manhattan, far enough north that the neighborhood had a different texture. Quieter streets, older buildings, the kind of residential density that was anonymous without being threatening. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, clean and spare, with a double lock on the front door and a window that looked out over a courtyard rather than the street. Diane sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room and looked around at the walls and said nothing for a while. "I'm going to need some things," she finally said. "Make a list," Emma said. "I'll get them tomorrow." "My good coat is still at the house." "I'll get it." Diane looked at her hands. "He's going to try to come here. He doesn't know about this place. He knew about the shelter." Emma sat down beside her on the bed. The mattress was new, or near enough. The room smelled like the faint, neutral cleanness of a space that had been recently prepared. "That was a specific situation with a specific failure," Emma said. This is different. You said that about the last plan. It wasn't accusatory. Diane delivered it with the flat weariness of someone in possession of an accurate historical record, which was worse than accusation because it left nothing to argue with. Emma sat with it for a moment. You're right, she said. I did say that. She looked at her mother. And this time might go wrong too. I don't have a guarantee, but we're further from him right now than we've been in 20 years. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it stays that way. Diane was quiet. Then she said, Who is he, the man? His name is Lucien. I know his name. That's not what I asked. Emma looked at her mother. At the perceptiveness in her face, the quality of attention that years of living in the heightened awareness of a dangerous household had sharpened into something close to clinical. Diane Whitlock had survived 22 years by being very good at reading people and what they stood to cost her. She was not the fragile woman the exterior sometimes suggested. I don't know everything about him yet, Emma said. What I know is complicated. Complicated how? His family's history is not clean. He's been trying to change that. She paused. There are people who don't want him to. Diane looked at the wall. And those people now know about us. Yes. Because of him. Emma thought about this honestly. Because of the choice I made to stay in contact with him, she said. I can follow the line of cause and effect in other directions too, but that's the honest one. Diane nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Not acceptance, exactly. Just the decision to continue with available information rather than waiting for better. Emma stayed until her mother was in bed and the lights were off and she could hear the particular quality of breathing that indicated, if not sleep, at least the direction of it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She could count on one hand the number of times in her adult life she'd stood in a doorway and watched her mother move toward sleep without the concurrent awareness of Grant, somewhere in the same structure, and what mood he was in, and what the morning would require. She couldn't name what she was feeling. It was too large and too multiple to fit inside a single word. She came out into the main room. Lucien was standing by the window, not looking out of it, with his phone in his hand. He'd been on it for parts of the last hour. Quiet, specific calls, the kind that moved pieces rather than conveyed information. And he looked up when Emma came out. She okay? He said, defining okay loosely. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. I need to tell you something. His tone. Emma registered it with the part of her nervous system that had been calibrated across years of living in proximity to the specific atmospheric shift that preceded bad news. She sat down on the couch. Say it. He sat down across from her. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, the first time she'd seen him operate outside his characteristic upright stillness, and he looked at the floor briefly and then at her. The federal case, he said. I told you I've been cooperating. What I didn't tell you is the scope of it. He paused. I've been cooperating for 14 months. In that time, I've given them financial records going back 18 years, operational structures, contact networks, and testimony that directly implicates 11 individuals currently active in Serrano's organization. Another pause, briefer. 3 of those individuals are people my father considered close friends. One is a man who attended my mother's funeral. Sotambatsigi Sami's son. Emma held his gaze. And 2 days ago, the lead prosecutor called me to say there's been a leak. Inside their office, someone accessed the sealed cooperation agreement. He looked at her steadily. Serrano has known for at least 72 hours that I'm the source. The room was very quiet. Emma sat with this, assembled it against the sequence of the last 3 days. The call to her phone on Wednesday night, the calm voice, the friendly advice. Grant's sudden appearance at the shelter tonight with Serrano's contact number in the relay chain, the speed with which the 2 situations had merged into a single one. He's known since before he called me, she said. Yes, and he let me know he knew, and then he made contact with Grant. She could hear herself working through it, not asking questions but thinking out loud, which was something she did when she was building an accurate picture from available evidence and didn't want the map to be wrong. He's not just trying to pressure you, he's building a containment structure, multiple points of leverage, so that when he applies pressure, there's nowhere to move. Lucien looked at her with something in his face she hadn't seen before, something that recognized what she'd just done. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. She stood up. She needed to move. She crossed to the window and looked out at the courtyard. Dark, quiet, a single lamp in the corner throwing a circle of amber onto the pavement. She thought about Serrano, about the voice on the phone, about a man who was calm enough and patient enough to build a structure rather than make a single move, which was considerably more dangerous than the alternative. What does he actually want? She said without turning from the window. He wants the cooperation terminated. He wants the testimony retracted. He wants enough leverage to make both of those things happen. A pause. And if that's not available, he wants the case to collapse on its own weight, through missing witnesses, destroyed evidence, or the kind of chaos that makes federal prosecutors decide a case isn't prosecutable. And if you retract the testimony, the case collapses. 11 people walk. The organization continues. His voice remained level. And I spend the rest of my life in the position my father spent his, which is a version of the thing I've been spending 14 months trying to end. Emma turned from the window, looked at him across the spare, clean room. He's going to come at us directly, she said. Whatever the strategy is, at some point it becomes direct. He can't manage this from a distance indefinitely. I know. And when that happens, my mother being safe depends entirely on this address staying unknown. Yes. And us staying ahead of whatever his next move is. Yes. She looked at him for a moment, at the tiredness in him and the steadiness underneath it, and the specific quality of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is now fully in the consequences of it with no possibility of stepping back. She recognized this, not because she'd seen it before in someone else, but because she realized, in a version of the same posture. She'd said no on a sidewalk. She'd brought her mother here. She'd watched the map expand past its original boundaries, and she had not run. Not because she was certain about what to do next, but because running had a destination, and she didn't have one anymore. She only had forward. Okay, she said. So, what's next? He opened his mouth to answer. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something crossed his face. Brief, controlled, but present. He answered. He listened for 11 seconds without speaking, and Emma watched his face during those 11 seconds with the precise attention of someone reading a language they're still learning. He lowered the phone. That was my contact at the federal prosecutor's office, he said. His voice was level and careful in the way of someone placing words down with deliberate weight. The leak was bigger than they initially assessed. A pause. The sealed list of protected witnesses in the case. Everyone I identified, everyone who agreed to testify, everyone currently under any form of federal protection in connection with this prosecution, that list has been accessed. Emma stood very still. All of them? She said. All of them. How many people? 14, he said, including the 2 who are most critical to the prosecution's timeline. He was looking at her with the flat, directed quality of someone delivering information to a person who has a right to it and who will handle it better than the alternative. One of them is in the hospital in New Jersey with a broken collarbone he received falling down a flight of stairs in his apartment building at 9 o'clock this evening. The cold that moved through Emma's chest was not like anything she had a previous name for. It was specific and systemic, and it moved through her the way understanding moves, not arriving at the surface first, but going deep before she could catch it. Serrano moved tonight, she said. He moved tonight, Lucian said, while we were moving your mother. He is not building a containment structure. The structure is already built. He put the phone in his pocket. He's inside it, and now he's... The window exploded inward, not the glass, the frame, the mechanism of it, the locked latch giving way under something external and deliberate, and the cold night air coming in and the courtyard lamp throwing its amber circle through the open space, and Emma already moving, not toward the door, away from the window, her body making the decision before her mind had completed the sentence because 12 years of living in proximity to sudden violence had installed something in her nervous system that did not wait for conscious instruction. Lucien was across the room in 2 steps, between her and the window. A hand appeared on the exterior sill. Then a face. Not Grant, not a face she recognized. A young man with close-cropped hair and the operational blankness of someone doing a job. He was through the window and on his feet in the room in 3 seconds. And he was not alone, because through the open frame Emma could hear movement in the courtyard below. And she understood with the cold certain clarity of someone whose map had just been revised again, that the address they'd believed was clean had been known before they arrived. Lucian moved toward the man with the same economy she'd watched twice before. The single, precise action. But the man had something in his hand, and the room was small, and there were sounds from the corridor now. The specific sound of the building's interior. And Emma turned toward the door to the spare room where her mother was sleeping. And she got there first, and she turned the lock from the inside and put her back against it, and looked at the room, and her mother sitting up in bed in the half-dark with the expression of a woman waking into something she has spent 20 years half expecting. And Emma looked at her mother's face and felt something change in her own, something that had been, up until this moment, the specific texture of someone trying to protect a situation, managing it, containing it, navigating it with the skills she had. That texture was gone. What replaced it was something older and less negotiable, and it had her mother's face at the center of it, and it had no patience left for navigation. She looked at the window in the spare room, courtyard facing, third floor, a drop of approximately 25 feet to the pavement, and then at the door behind her and what was happening on the other side of it. And she made the calculation the way you make calculations when the number of available options had been reduced to 2, and Emma chose the one that kept her mother alive. She crossed the room in 4 steps, grabbed Diane's arm, pulled her off the bed, and toward the window. Diane made no sound, no protest, no question, just got up and moved with the focused compliance of a woman whose body had learned to respond to urgency faster than her mind processed it. "Fire escape," Emma said. "Is there one?" She was already at the window looking. No fire escape on this side. The courtyard below was 25 feet down and partially lit, and she could see 2 figures moving across it toward the building's rear entrance. They'd covered the ground exit. Behind her, through the locked door, the sound of impact. Once. Twice. "Emma!" Diane's voice, controlled and very quiet. "I hear it." Her phone. She pulled it out. Lucien's number. She hit it, and it rang twice, and he answered, and she could hear from the quality of his breathing that he was still upright and functional and managing something physical. "Spare room," she said. "Window side faces the courtyard. 2 of them below. Door behind us." "Stay on the floor," he said. "Away from the door, 60 seconds. He hung up. 60 seconds was not an abstraction. 60 seconds in a room with a door being hit from the other side had a specific physical texture. The way time expanded and compressed simultaneously, the way her heartbeat was so loud and so present she could feel it in her back teeth, the way Diane's hand in hers was completely steady, which was somehow the most clarifying thing in the room. Emma pulled her mother to the floor against the exterior wall, below the window line. She picked up the only object in the room with any mass, a ceramic lamp from the bedside table. And she held it, and she looked at the door, and she counted. The door came off its hinges on the 48th second. Not the lock giving, the hinges themselves, 3 of them, the door falling inward in a single flat piece. The man who came through was not the one from the window. This one was larger, and he had the specific forward momentum of someone who'd been applying force to something and is still carrying that energy into the next available space. Emma threw the lamp. Not accurately. She knew it wouldn't be accurate. But the movement made him flinch and redirect his momentum, and in that 2-second interval, Lucian came through the open doorway behind him. What happened in the next 8 seconds, Emma could not have described with any chronological precision. It was fast and loud, and involved the specific sounds that bodies make when force is applied to them at the angle and velocity that Lucian was applying. And it involved furniture and the wall, and a sound she felt in her back that she identified later as someone's shoulder meeting the plaster with significant speed. Then it was quiet. The large man was on the floor. Lucienne was standing over him, breathing hard. She could see it now, the effort visible in the way his chest moved. The first time she'd seen the physical cost of any of this break through the surface. He had a cut above his left eyebrow, shallow, but producing the specific generosity that scalp wounds produced, and he pressed the back of his hand against it without looking at it. "Can you walk?" he said. To both of them, but looking at Emma. "Yes," Emma said. "Then we move now." He went first into the main room, which had the particular disordered stillness of a space where something had happened recently. The first man, the one who'd come through the window, was zip-tied to the radiator with what appeared to be his own belt and a length of electrical cord from a dismantled floor lamp. He was conscious and looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone revising their evening's expectations. Lucien had come prepared for a version of this. Emma registered that fact and filed it without commentary because this was not the moment for commentary. They went into the corridor. Clear. Down the stairs, Lucien slightly ahead, Diane between them, Emma behind, the three of them moving with the rapid, coordinated rhythm of people who have just undergone an event that has stripped the situation to its functional essentials. Out through a side exit Emma hadn't known was there. Lucien had known the building's geography before they arrived, which meant he'd planned for this, which meant on some level he'd known the address might be compromised before they used it, and she was going to have a conversation with him about that when they were in a position to have it. Not yet. The side exit opened onto a narrow service alley between the building and the next one. A car was waiting. Not Rael's sedan, a different vehicle, dark gray, engine running. The driver was a woman Emma had never seen, 40s with the same operational composure as Rael, who did not acknowledge their arrival beyond unlocking the doors. They got in. The car moved. Diane sat in the middle seat and her hands were folded in her lap, and she stared straight forward through the windshield, and Emma sat beside her and could feel the tremor in her mother's body, fine and controlled and present, the physical residue of fear that the mind was managing but the body was still processing. She put her hand over her mother's folded ones and felt the tremor slow marginally. Lucien was in the front seat. He was on his phone again. The cut above his eye had slowed to a thin track of red along his temple, and he pressed a cloth against it that the driver had handed him without being asked. They drove south. Emma looked out the window at the city moving past, the upper Manhattan blocks giving way to the gradual compression of Midtown, and she thought about the courtyard and the two figures moving toward the building's entrance and the fact that Serrano had known the address. She turned this over in her mind with the methodical persistence she brought to things that didn't add up. "How did he know the Inwood address?" she said. Lucien lowered the phone. He turned in the seat to look at her. "Tell me you don't know," she said, "and I'll believe you, but tell me the truth." "I don't know with certainty," he said. "My best working theory is a tracker on the car, Rael's sedan, placed sometime in the last 48 hours. He paused. "We switched vehicles, but Rael drove to the Inwood building directly from the shelter, which means if the sedan was tagged before we switched, the address was already logged before we arrived." "You switched vehicles?" "Yes, for exactly this reason, but not early enough." "No," he said, "not early enough." Emma looked at him, at the blood drying on his temple and the steadiness of his eyes and the honest, unqualified delivery of no, not early enough, which most people would have dressed in some kind of mitigation. "Where are we going?" she said. "A federal building on Varick Street. My contact in the prosecutor's office. Her name is Agent Solis. She's been running the cooperation for 14 months. She's there now. She's been there since the leak was confirmed." He looked at Emma steadily. "Serrano moving tonight changed the timetable. Everything we were building toward a trial that was 4 months away. Solis wants to move on it now, before he dismantles any more of the case infrastructure. She needs me there." "Tonight. Tonight." Emma looked out the window again. They were on the West Side Highway now, the Hudson moving dark and flat to the right, the opposite shore a low line of New Jersey lights. "And my mother," she said. "Solis can put her in protective custody, federal protective custody, not a shelter with a cash-bribed intake worker. A secure location with people whose only function is to make sure she's there tomorrow morning." Diane made a small sound. Not protest. More the sound of someone absorbing a sentence that contains a reality they've been approaching for a long time and are now very close to. "Mom," Emma said. "I heard." Diane looked at her hands. "I heard him." A pause. "I want to be somewhere he can't find me. I don't care what it's called." Vomit. The federal building on Varick Street had the specific nighttime quality of institutions that never fully sleep. A skeleton crew on the lower floors, more activity above, the security at the entrance precise and unhurried. Agent Solis met them in the lobby. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, dark-haired with the slightly compressed look of someone who had been awake longer than was reasonable and had decided not to acknowledge it. She looked at Lucien's cut and then at Emma and then at Diane, and she said to the agent behind her, "Get them upstairs." She pulled Lucien aside. Emma watched them from across the lobby, the low, rapid exchange, Solis's face moving through a sequence of expressions that were controlled and specific and told Emma nothing clearly except that the information being exchanged was significant and that Solis's read of it produced something that wasn't quite alarm but occupied the adjacent territory. Then Solis looked across the lobby at Emma. Emma held her gaze. She didn't look away, didn't shift. Solis came over. "Ms. Whitlock," she said. Her voice was the direct, undecorated voice of someone who was tired and operating at the far edge of a long effort and had dispensed with the preamble. "Your mother will be in a secure location in 40 minutes. I need you to believe me when I tell you that." She paused. "And I need to talk to you about something you may not be aware of." "Go ahead." Solis looked at her for one more second, the look of someone making a decision about how to deliver information. Then she said, "The man Grant Holloway, your stepfather." "Yes." "He came to this building 3 days ago." Emma went still. "He wasn't here to see us," Solis said. "He came in response to a contact initiated by Victor Serrano's attorney. He met with the attorney in the lobby. Public space, nothing we could act on, for approximately 20 minutes. She kept her eyes on Emma's face. "We have him on camera. We have partial audio from a proximity microphone that one of my agents had in the vicinity by chance." Another pause. "The conversation concerned you." Emma's throat felt tight in a specific way she recognized from the restaurant, from the stairwell, from the bathroom doorway. The physiological response of someone who has just absorbed a sentence that has permanently altered a piece of their understanding of their own life. "What about me?" she said. "Serrano's attorney offered Holloway a financial arrangement, a specific sum in exchange for information about your movements and your relationship with Lucian Ashcroft." Solis delivered this with the flat precision of a woman reciting testimony. Holloway accepted. The lobby of the federal building, the clean institutional light, the sound of the city muted behind glass, her mother somewhere behind her with a federal agent moving toward an elevator, Lucienne across the lobby, watching her. Grant had taken money to tell Serrano where she was. Grant had taken money from the man who had coordinated the events of the last 48 hours. The leak, the shelter, the Inwood address, the men through the window, and had fed information about Emma's life, Emma's location, Emma's connection to Lucienne, into that structure, and had done it 3 days ago, which meant he'd done it before the shelter, before tonight, before any of it, which meant the thing Emma had believed was her stepfather's violence and desperation and need for control was also, at some level, a transaction. She'd known Grant was capable of many things. She had not known this was one of them. She stood in the lobby and she felt the anger move through her, and this time she did not bank it, and she did not manage it, and she did not reach for the fork tines under the table. She let it be present, full and real and enormous, and she breathed through it until it became something she could operate inside rather than something that operated her. "Where is he now?" she said. "Currently, we don't have his location," Solis said. "But we will. And when we do, there will be a separate conversation about what he's done here." She paused. "He's made himself part of this case." Emma nodded. One nod, precise. "I need to ask you something," Solis said. "Ask." Lucienne's testimony, the cooperation. He's told you the scope of it. It wasn't a question. "I need to know if you're going to be a complicating factor." Emma looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means that the next 12 hours are going to require him to make choices that will have permanent consequences for his legal standing, his business, and his safety. And I need to know that the personal dimension of this," Solis paused, looking for the precise word, "isn't going to produce a variable I can't account for." Emma understood what she was being asked. She was being assessed, measured for the specific kind of liability that women in proximity to key witnesses represented in the institutional imagination, the soft target, the emotional complication, the factor that made men make decisions from their gut instead of their head. "I'm not a complicating factor," Emma said. "I'm the reason the information about my movements reached Serrano at all, which makes me part of this whether you account for me or not. So you should account for me." Solis looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in her face, not softening, more a recalibration of her read of what was standing in front of her. "Fair enough," she said. "Come upstairs." The room upstairs was a conference room with a long table and too many chairs and a whiteboard covered in a system of names and connecting lines that Emma took in with one sweep before she sat down. Lucien was already seated at the table. Two other agents Emma hadn't met were on the far side. Solis stood at the head. Solis put a photograph on the table. Victor Serrano was shorter than Emma had imagined from the voice on the phone. 60s, compact and gray-haired, with a face that was unremarkable in every dimension except the eyes, which had the flat, patient quality of something that spent a lot of time waiting. He looked like someone's retired accountant. He looked like someone who could stand in a room without being remembered. "He's in the city," Solis said. "He flew in from Miami this morning, which tells us tonight wasn't improvised. This was planned well ahead of the information from the leak." She looked at Lucien. "He came here to resolve this personally." "He always preferred direct resolution," Lucien said. "He and my father had that in common. We have a location as of 2 hours ago. A property in Brooklyn Heights registered to a holding company with 14 layers of corporate structure, but we got through them." Solis put another photograph on the table. "An aerial view of a building. We're prepared to move tonight if Lucien completes the sworn statement that the prosecution needs to support the warrant." She looked at Lucien directly. "The statement you were supposed to give 4 months from now at trial. We need it tonight." Lucien looked at the photographs on the table. He looked at them for a long moment with the specific, particular quality of someone looking at a decision they made 14 months ago, arriving at the moment it costs the most. "If I give the statement tonight," he said, "the company's assets are frozen immediately, the foreign accounts, the domestic operations. All of it stops." He said this with full understanding of what he was saying. Some of those operations are completely legitimate. Employees, contracts. I've spent 4 years building the clean version of what my father built. And if everything freezes tonight, it restarts, Solis said. "When the case closes, the legitimate operations get separated and restored. That's in the cooperation agreement." "I know what's in the agreement." His voice didn't sharpen, it just became more precise. "I'm not looking for reassurance. I'm making sure we're both clear on what tonight costs." "I'm clear," Solis said. "Are you?" He looked across the table at Emma. She looked back at him. She thought about a 14-year-old applying whatever pressure was available. She thought about her mother in a shelter room and the specific sound of a door coming off its hinges. She thought about the voice on the phone. He's only half right. And the photograph of a compact, gray-haired man who had flown from Miami this morning, specifically to resolve this, and who had bought her stepfather's compliance with a number on a check. She thought about what staying quiet looked like from the outside. "Don't look at me," she said. "This is your call." "I know," he said. "I'm not looking for permission." A pause. "I'm looking at what I'm doing it for." The conference room was very quiet. Emma held his gaze. He turned to Solis. "Get me the statement," he said. "Let's finish this." Solis nodded once to the agent on her left, who left the room. She looked back at the table. "There's one more thing," she said, and her voice had a quality Emma hadn't heard in it yet, something below the operational flatness. "The leak in our office. We identified the source an hour ago." She put a third photograph on the table. Emma leaned forward. The photograph was a surveillance image, grainy, a corridor somewhere, a man in a suit with his back partially to the camera. But the face was angled enough to be visible, and Emma looked at it, and the cold that moved through her was different from all the previous cold because this one had a flavor she recognized from the lobby of the shelter and from 12 years of a kitchen and from a restaurant on West 54th Street where a man had publicly done what he'd been doing privately for years. The man in the photograph was not a federal employee. He was Grant. He had been in this building not once, but 3 times in the past 2 weeks. The attorney was a front. The real meetings had been with an asset Serrano had inside the prosecutor's office, and Grant had been the courier. The photographs, the financial records Lucien had provided, the witness list, pieces of it had moved through Grant Holloway's hands before they moved to Serrano. Her stepfather was not a man who'd made a desperate deal on one bad night. He had been part of the structure. He had been recruited and placed, or had offered himself and been accepted, and either possibility said the same thing, that the situation Emma had spent 12 years understanding as her private damage, her family's specific wound, her mother's specific prison, had been known about and useful to someone outside it, which meant it had never been only what she thought it was. The room was very still. Lucien was watching her. Solis was watching her. Emma picked up the photograph and held it, and looked at the grainy image of Grant's half-turned face in a corridor of a federal building, and felt something shift in the architecture of everything she'd ever understood about the last 12 years. A tectonic, foundational movement, the kind that doesn't announce itself as it's happening, but leaves the landscape permanently different when it's done. He was never just an abusive drunk, she said. Not to anyone in particular, to the room, to the fact of it. No, Solis said quietly. He wasn't. Emma set the photograph back down on the table. She set it down carefully, face up, in the center of the table where everyone could see it, and she straightened it with 2 fingers until its edges were parallel to the table's edge, which was a very small and pointless act of order in the middle of a very large and structural disorder. And she did it anyway because her hands needed something precise to do before she said what she said next. "Where is he right now?" she said. Specifically. "Emma," Lucien started, "I'm not asking so I can do anything," she said. "I'm asking because I'm done not knowing things." Solis looked at her. "Last confirmed location was a bar on the east side 90 minutes ago." Emma nodded. The door opened. The agent came back in with a folder. The statement thick with the weight of 14 months of documented cooperation. The testimony of a man dismantling his father's empire page by page. He put it in front of Lucien. Lucien uncapped a pen. He signed the first page. Outside the windows of the conference room, 23 floors up, the city was doing what it always did at this hour. Moving, breathing, carrying its several million lives through the dark, with the impersonal efficiency of a system that doesn't wait for anyone's story to resolve before continuing. The Hudson was out there somewhere, dark and flat. Brooklyn was out there. A property in Brooklyn Heights with 14 layers of corporate structure and a man inside it who had flown from Miami this morning with the intention of ending something, not knowing that the thing he'd come to end had already, in the last 60 minutes, changed shape entirely. Lucien signed the last page. Solis picked it up. She looked at it once, then at the agent beside her. "Get the warrant," she said. The agent left at speed. Solis's phone rang. She answered. She listened for 4 seconds, and her face made a movement that Emma read as the movement of something arriving too early, before the infrastructure was ready for it. She lowered the phone. "He's moved," she said. "Serrano. He left the Brooklyn Heights property 20 minutes ago." She looked at the table. "He's in Manhattan." A pause. "He's been tracked to Amsterdam Avenue." She looked at Emma. "The block your bookstore is on." Emma was on her feet before she knew she'd decided to stand. "He's not going to the bookstore," Lucien said. "He was already up, already moving. He's sending a message. He knows we're here. He knows the statement is signed. He's telling us he can still reach the things that matter before the warrant executes." "My coworkers," Emma said. "Marcus opens at 6. He gets there at 5:45. She looked at the clock on the wall. 5:18. "We have 27 minutes, she said, and she was already at the door, and Solis was already on her radio, and Lucien was behind her, and the conference room was behind all of them, and the hallway was in front of them, and the elevator was 20 feet away, and the city was outside 23 floors below, with everything in it moving toward the same 27 minutes. And Emma walked toward the elevator with the specific quality of someone who has spent their whole life arriving late to their own defense and has decided completely and finally. They were in the car at 5:21. Solis had 2 vehicles ahead of them and 1 behind, and Rael, back now, different car, same operational composure, pushed through the pre-dawn Manhattan streets with the focused urgency of someone who understood that traffic laws were a framework for normal conditions, and that these were not those. Emma sat in the back with her phone in her hand and Marcus's number on the screen, and she hit call and listened to it ring 4 times and go to voicemail, and she hit it again. "He might not be there yet," Lucien said. "He's always there by 5:40. "It's 5:22. She hit the number a 3rd time. Marcus answered on the 2nd ring, his voice carrying the slightly blurred quality of someone who had been awake for less than an hour. "Emma? What?" "Don't go to the store," she said. "I need you to stay wherever you are right now and not go to the store." A pause. "I'm 2 blocks away. I was just—" "Marcus, stop walking. Right now." Silence. Then, "Okay." I stopped. What's happening? I'll explain everything later. Just stay on the line with me and don't go any closer to the building. She looked out the window, the West Side Highway moving fast, the Hudson a dark strip to the right. Are you okay? Are you on the street? I'm on the corner of 76th and Amsterdam. Emma, you're scaring me. I know, I'm sorry. Just stay there. She kept him on the line. Lucy Yen watched her without speaking. Outside, the city moved past in the specific flat-lit gray of 5:20 in October. The sky not yet light, the streets not yet populated with the morning's full weight, a transitional quality to everything as though the day had not yet committed to beginning. They turned on to Amsterdam at 5:31. She saw the bookstore from half a block away. Harding and Clay, the dark green awning, the window display she'd arranged herself 3 days ago, the stacked paperbacks behind glass. The lights were off inside. The street in front of it was quiet. She also saw the man standing on the opposite sidewalk. He wasn't doing anything. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and looking at the storefront with the patient attention of someone who had time and knew it. Compact, gray-haired. Unremarkable in every dimension except for the fact that he was standing on Amsterdam Avenue at 5:30 in the morning looking at a bookstore. Victor Serrano, no intermediary, no attorney, no courier, no asset in someone else's office. He had come himself, which was either confidence or desperation presenting as confidence, and Emma had spent enough time reading people in dangerous emotional states to know the difference was not always visible from the outside. The cars stopped. Solis was out first, and 2 agents Emma didn't know were out a half-second behind her, and Solis had her credentials in one hand and was covering the distance between the vehicle and Serrano with the particular stride of someone who has executed this specific moment in practice enough times that the real version feels almost routine, except that it never actually is. Emma got out. Lucien said her name. She kept going. She crossed the street with the agents fanning around her, and she came to a stop 6 feet from Victor Serrano, and she looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light, and she saw, up close, what the surveillance photograph had not transmitted, that he was old. Not decrepit, not diminished, but old in the way that men who have spent their lives in high-pressure environments become old, compressed rather than softened, the years laid down in the face like sediment, dense and accumulated. His eyes were the same in person as in the photograph. Patient, flat, looking at her now with the specific attention of someone assessing a variable they'd perhaps underestimated. Solis reached him first. Victor Serrano. Her voice, flat and certain. Credentials up. Federal agents, do not move. Serrano did not move. He looked at Solis with a mild expression, the expression of someone who has been introduced to people at parties they did not want to attend. He looked at the agents to his left and right. He looked at Lucien, who had come across the street and was standing 8 feet away with his hands at his sides and his face carrying a quality Emma had not seen in it before. The specific quality of a long-anticipated moment arriving exactly as expected, which was both a relief and a grief simultaneously. Then Serrano looked at Emma. He looked at her for 4 or 5 seconds. He looked at her the way the voice on the phone had sounded, with the unhurried attention of someone determining the weight of a thing. "You're the bookstore girl," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it from the phone call, calm, precise, no performance in it. "I'm the reason the warrant exists," Emma said. "Don't call me a girl." Something moved in Serrano's face. It was not the almost smile she'd seen in Lucien. It was something colder and more involuntary, the micro-expression of someone encountering an unexpected texture in a situation they believed they had fully mapped. Solis moved in. He did not resist. He turned and put his hands behind his back with the practiced movement of someone who had known, on some level, that this was how the sequence ended, had known it since he got on the plane in Miami, had perhaps known it since the cooperation agreement was signed 14 months ago and the shape of the endgame became visible if you were paying the right kind of attention, which Victor Serrano, in Emma's assessment, had always been doing. He just miscalculated where the resistance would come from. The cuffs went on. Solis was already on her radio, coordinating the simultaneous movements that Emma understood were happening elsewhere in the city, the coordinated raids that 14 months of documentation and a signed sworn statement had made possible. Names from the whiteboard in the conference room, 11 individuals. the organizational structure of something built over decades coming apart at multiple points at once. Emma stood on Amsterdam Avenue in the gray October pre-dawn and watched Victor Serrano be placed in a federal vehicle, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not triumph, not the clean completion of a thing achieved. What she felt was closer to exhaustion, meeting relief, meeting the particular spaciousness that arrives when something that has been taking up enormous volume in your life abruptly stops requiring that volume. Like a sound you've been compensating for so long you forgot you were doing it, and then it stops, and the silence has its own adjustment period. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. She'd forgotten he was on the line. He'd apparently walked the remaining 2 blocks while the situation resolved. He looked at the federal vehicles, at the agents, at Lucien, at the pre-dawn street. "Okay," he said. "I'm going to need that explanation." "Later," Emma said. "Much later?" "Yes." He nodded with the resigned acceptance of someone who had, over years of working with Emma, developed a tolerance for incomplete information delivered with total certainty. He went and unlocked the bookstore and turned on the interior lights, because it was 5:40, and that was what you did. Emma watched the lights come on behind the green awning, the window display she'd arranged, a rotating feature on debut novels, a small handwritten card in the corner in her own writing, lit up from inside. Lucien stood beside her. They stood there for a moment without speaking. The city was starting its morning shift around them. The first bus of the route coming down Amsterdam, a delivery truck turning onto the block, a woman with a dog moving along the opposite sidewalk with the specific purposeful walk of someone who had somewhere to be and was already thinking about it. The normalcy of it was almost disorienting. "Grant," Emma said. "They'll pick him up today," Lucien said. "Solis has enough from the corridor footage and the phone records for an obstruction charge, minimum, probably more." He paused. "He's not going to be able to move freely after today." Emma thought about this. Thought about the photograph. The grainy image of Grant's half-turned face in a federal building corridor, carrying pieces of Lucien's testimony to a man who'd used them to try to dismantle a prosecution, and, collaterally, to find Emma's mother in a shelter. She thought about the specific casual evil of that sequence. The domestic violence that had spent 12 years presenting itself as a private wound, and had been, some portion of it, connected to something larger and more deliberate than a drunk man's cruelty. She didn't know what to do with that yet. It was too large and too recent to process cleanly. She filed it in the place she'd been filing large and recent things, a temporary location, not resolution, just storage until she had the capacity. "My mother," she said. "Solis's team will release her to regular protective custody by noon," Lucien said. "After today, there's no operational reason to keep her there. The structure that was using Grant to track her is gone." He looked at Emma. "She can go wherever she wants to go." Emma thought about her mother's hands, folded in her lap in the back seat of the car, the tremor that had slowed when Emma covered them with hers. She took out her phone and texted the secure secondary number. "It's over. I'll come to you this morning." 3 minutes later, one word back. "Okay, just okay." Which, from Diane Whitlock at 5:45 in the morning after the night they'd just had, was its own complete and sufficient sentence. Well, she didn't sleep. She went home to her apartment as the morning came in through the windows, and she sat in the reading chair and she didn't sleep and she didn't try to. She made tea and drank half of it. She looked at the books on every surface, the stacks that had accumulated over years of the kind of reading that was not an aesthetic preference, but a survival mechanism. The paper worlds she'd been stepping into since she was 8 years old and had discovered that you could go somewhere else inside a sentence without physically going anywhere. She thought about that 8-year-old, about the specific strategies she'd developed layered over 12 years for managing an unmanageable situation. The fork tines under the table, the exits cataloged, the anger banked, the sleeve kept down. 12 years of daily maintenance of a containment structure that she'd called surviving, and that had perhaps also been, on some level, a failure of imagination. The failure to imagine that the structure could come down. She sat with this without trying to resolve it, because some things didn't resolve into clean lessons, and forcing them into that shape was its own kind of dishonesty. At 7:30, she called Lucy. He answered on the second ring. His voice had the texture of someone who also hadn't slept but was functional inside it. "Where are you?" she said. "Federal building still. There are a lot of statements. Are you okay?" A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me in a week." "I'll ask you in a week," she said. Another pause, briefer. "Are you okay?" She looked at the room around her, the books, the tea going cold, the morning light coming in at its low October angle, finding the dust on the windowsill and the worn arm of the reading chair, and the specific impermanence of everything. "I don't know yet either," she said, "but I think I'm going to be." "That's more honest than most people manage," he said. "I've been working on honest," she said. "It's a recent project." She could hear something in his voice that was close to the almost smile. She hung up and went to get her mother. The weeks that followed had a texture she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected, in some vague way, a before and after clarity. The thing ends, the life begins, the division crisp and legible. What she got instead was more granular and more real than that. The days continued. The bookstore continued. She shelved books and recommended them, and ordered stock, and had conversations about the new fiction table that were so entirely normal they occasionally felt surreal. Diane moved into an apartment 2 miles from Emma's, a one-bedroom with a courtyard that got afternoon light. She'd chosen it herself, which Emma had insisted upon, and she'd signed her own lease, which she'd needed 20 minutes of sitting in the leasing office before she could do, and she'd done it. The pen in her hand and her name at the bottom of a document that contained only her name. Emma had been there. She hadn't watched her mother sign. She'd looked at the courtyard through the window and given Diane the privacy of the moment. Grant was arrested 11 days after that night on a federal obstruction charge and 3 additional counts related to his role in the information relay. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. Emma read about it in an article she found online by accident, not looking for it, and she sat with the article open on her phone for a long time, and then she closed it and made dinner and did not call anyone about it. There was, she found, very little satisfaction in it. Not the absence of relief, there was relief, real and structural, the kind that settled into the body's daily operations rather than arriving as a feeling. But the satisfaction she'd imagined, the sense of scales correcting, that was quieter and stranger than she'd expected. What she found instead was that her mother, 3 weeks into the apartment with the courtyard, had begun buying plants, specifically succulents, because she'd read they were hard to kill, and she wanted to practice not killing things. Emma found this to be the most significant development of the entire period. Lucien's company assets were frozen for 6 weeks and then restored in the legitimate portions while the criminal case proceeded. He spent a month in depositions and hearings and the particular grinding administrative aftermath of a federal prosecution, which was less cinematic than its build-up and more exhausting than anything that had preceded it. He called Emma during this period with the practical frequency of someone reporting in, not nightly, not daily by schedule, but when something happened that he thought she should know about, and when the day ended in a way that made a voice on the other end of a phone the thing he wanted. She called him too, for the same reasons. They were, Emma thought, 2 people learning to be in the same place at the same time without a crisis requiring it, which was considerably harder than being in the same place at the same time because a crisis was requiring it. The crisis had its own grammar. The ordinary required a different one, and they were both rusty at it, or had never learned it, or had learned it in such damaged versions that unlearning was prerequisite to relearning. It was slow. It was not always comfortable. It was, she thought, honest, which was what she'd said she was working on. She went back to the therapist she'd stopped seeing at 21 because the sessions had hit a wall she hadn't been ready to break through. She was readier now. The wall was the same wall. She broke through it differently this time, which was less a matter of force and more a matter of having finally run out of reasons to maintain it. Diane started therapy 2 weeks later, referred by Emma's therapist to someone who specialized in long-term domestic situations. She came to dinner at Emma's apartment the Sunday after her first session, and she was quieter than usual, and Emma didn't ask, and they cooked together and ate together, and Diane washed the dishes because she said she wanted to. And at the end of the evening, she stood in Emma's doorway in her coat with her hand on the doorframe and said, "I want to apologize to you." Emma looked at her. "Mom, not tonight," Diane said. "I'm not ready tonight. My therapist says I need to do it when I can do it completely, not part way, and I'm not there yet. She held Emma's gaze with the steady attention that Emma now recognized was her mother's baseline, that it had always been her baseline, just buried under 20 years of a situation that required its suppression. But I want you to know it's coming, and that I mean it. I know you do, Emma said. Diane nodded. She squeezed Emma's hand where it rested on the doorframe. Then she went down the stairs and out into the evening, and Emma stood in her doorway and listened to her footsteps recede, and then the sound of the street, and she felt the grief and the love, and the specific complexity of the two existing simultaneously in the same space, which was, she thought, the permanent condition of certain things and not a problem to be solved. The indictments came down in December. Victor Serrano, 11 associates, and 2 additional individuals identified through the cooperation process that Lucien hadn't initially known about, but whose names surfaced during the investigation's expanded scope. The lead prosecutor issued a statement. Solis appeared briefly at a press conference with the careful non-expression of a federal agent appearing at a press conference. Lucien watched it on a laptop at Emma's kitchen table. When it ended, he closed the laptop and sat with his hands flat on the table for a moment, looking at the closed screen. Emma was making coffee across the kitchen, and she watched him from there. The specific quality of his stillness in this moment, which was different from his usual stillness. This one had more in it, more weight, more completion, more of the specific texture of someone at the end of a long effort and not yet certain what comes after it. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she'd noticed he did, gave questions their actual weight, before answering rather than producing the answer fastest available. "Like something I've been carrying for a long time is now on the ground," he said, "and my arms don't know what to do." Emma brought the coffee over. She put his cup in front of him and sat across the table and looked at him across the coffee cups and the December light coming through the window. "They'll figure it out," she said. "Eventually." "The figuring out is the project," she said. "That's what I've been told." He looked at her. The almost smile which she'd catalogued well enough now to know arrived when something she said surprised him into it. "By your therapist?" "By experience." He picked up the coffee cup, looked at her over the rim of it. Outside the window, the city conducted its December business. The specific dense movement of the city in winter, coats and scarves and breath visible in the cold, the early dark coming down at 4:30, and the lights going on in the buildings across the street in their staggered individual sequence. "I want to take you somewhere," he said. "Not tonight. When everything is a little more settled." "Where?" "The restaurant," he said. "The first one. Not the other place. The one I told you about before any of this. The one I wanted to take you to for dinner when I came into the bookstore." He paused. "We never actually got there." Emma thought about that. About the route the past 3 months had taken from a biography section on a Tuesday afternoon to a federal building conference room to a pre-dawn street on Amsterdam Avenue. The specific geography of it. The distance between asking someone to dinner and arriving at a kitchen table with the indictments settling. "Okay," she said. "That's all? Okay?" "You asked. I said okay." She looked at him steadily. "What else do you want?" He looked at her. Something in his face that wasn't the almost smile and wasn't the operational flatness and wasn't the steadiness under pressure she'd watched carry him through the last 3 months. Something older and less defended than any of those. "I want more days that look like this one," he said. "That's what I want." Emma held his gaze. The December light was behind him, and the coffee was warm in her hands, and the building across the street had all its windows lit now, the staggered individual lights of several dozen separate lives conducting their evenings behind glass. "That's a reasonable thing to want," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think it is." They sat at the kitchen table as the evening came down outside, and the city went on beyond the windows, and the coffee cooled slowly in their hands, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said. The silence was not the silence of the stairwell or the restaurant or the federal conference room. It was a different kind, the kind that arrives not from the management of danger, but from its absence, the kind that has to be learned or relearned, or in some cases learned for the first time. It had a texture Emma had not had enough practice identifying. She was starting to recognize it now. Somewhere across the city, her mother's apartment had its lights on. Her mother was possibly reading, or possibly looking at the succulents she was practicing not killing, or possibly sitting in the particular quiet of a person getting used to the sound of a space that belongs entirely to them. 2 miles away, which was close enough and also exactly the right distance. Emma sat at her kitchen table and the light came in and the coffee cooled and the city went on, and she thought that the timid 24-year-old who had spent dinner pressing fork tines into her thumb to stay present was not someone she'd neatly left behind, was still in here, still part of the architecture, still the ground floor of a building that had been adding floors without always reinforcing the ones beneath. But she was not the whole structure anymore. She was the foundation of a thing that had grown past her. That was not nothing. That was, Emma thought, the whole thing. Outside, the last of the December light let go of the sky entirely, and the city turned itself over to the dark and the cold and the uncountable illuminated windows, and the evening became what evenings become, which is simply the next thing. Not an ending, not a destination, just the next true hour of a life that had been, against considerable odds, returned to its owner.